The air in Hangar 12 shimmered with heat, the kind that made your lungs ache and your skin feel like it was cooking under the relentless Nevada sun. Inside, the scent of hydraulic fluid and scorched metal hung heavy, mingling with the low growl of idling engines and the sharp clatter of wrenches against steel. A battered radio in the corner spat out garbled tower chatter, its static blending with the hum of overworked air conditioning units fighting a losing battle against the desert. This was Ironwood Air Base, a sprawling military outpost where the machinery never slept, and neither did the egos. Mira Voss signed in at the duty desk with a hand that moved like it had filled out 1,000 forms under worse conditions. Dust storms, gunfire, you name it. Her handwriting was sharp, deliberate, each letter carved into the log like a signature on a battlefield report. She was maybe in her late 40s, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled into a tight braid that didn't waste a strand. Her coveralls were faded, patched at the knees, and her scuffed work boots bore the scars of years spent on unforgiving tarmac. In her left hand, a dented toolbox that looked like it had survived a war. In her right, a clipboard with edges worn soft from use. The duty sergeant, a grizzled man named Carver with engine grease etched into his knuckles and 25 years of rotorcraft repairs in his stare, glanced at her paperwork. Airframe inspection on the Apaches, huh? Been a minute since we had someone from your outfit. Last contractor thought a tail boom was a fuel tank. His voice was rough, but not unkind, testing her. Mira met his eyes, her gaze steady, unyielding. I'm not the last contractor. Her words were quiet, but they carried the weight of someone who'd earned their place in hangars like this one, where mistakes cost lives. Carver nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his face. He'd known crew chiefs like her before, veterans who could hear a failing bearing in the whine of an engine or spot a stress fracture by touch alone. Birds in Bay 4. Pre-flight's done, but you do what you need to. Holler if they give you grief. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't advertising herself either. Just another civilian tech, here to do a job on a Wednesday that bled into every other Wednesday in the military's endless grind. That's when Private First Class Kyle Driscoll decided she was his chance to feel big. Driscoll was 23, all spit-shined boots and starched fatigues, with the kind of smirk that came from thinking a single chevron made him king. Fresh from tech school, his first posting still felt like a game where he could bark orders and expect salutes. He'd flunked his latest systems exam, gotten reamed for misplacing a torque wrench, and watched his buddies pin on new ranks while he stayed stuck. He needed a target, and Mira, older, quieter, unassuming, looked like an easy one. "Hey, ma'am," he called from across the bay, leaning against a toolbox, forcing her to walk to him. "You here for the avionics check?" His voice was loud, performative, drawing eyes from the other mechanics. Mira paused, her pen hovering over her clipboard. Her eyes flicked to him, calm but piercing, like she was reading a threat board before a mission. "Airframe inspection," she said evenly. "Gonna need your clearance papers. New rules." Driscoll held out his hand, snapping his fingers like he was calling a waiter. Behind him, a small crowd was forming. Specialist Torres, barely 20, with hands still soft from civilian life. Airman First Class Lee, who'd rather be gaming than turning wrenches, and Senior Airman Diaz, older but too eager to fit in with the younger crew to shut this down. Mira pulled a laminated folder from her coveralls and handed it over without a word. Driscoll flipped through it, squinting at the stamps like he knew what they meant, though everyone in the bay could tell he was bluffing. "Says here you're cleared for airframe," he said, as if he'd caught her smuggling secrets. "That's not avionics access." "Airframe includes avionics mounts," Mira replied, her voice flat, factual. "Has since 19. Lee snickered. "She's schooling you, Driscoll." Driscoll's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to lose face in front of his audience. There was something about this woman that grated on him, maybe her calm, maybe the way she didn't flinch under his stare. "Rules changed again," he said, crossing his arms. "New EM shielding protocols. Can't have unauthorized tech near sensitive gear. Need to check you for hidden devices." The hangar's noise dipped, not to silence but to a tense murmur. Tools still clinked, engines still rumbled, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Carver looked up from his desk, his face hardening. "Driscoll, what the hell? I got this, Sarge." Driscoll cut him off, waving a hand. "Chain of command." Mira's expression didn't shift. "What kind of devices?" "Phones, recorders, transmitters," Driscoll said, his voice growing bolder. "Could be in your clothes, sewn into seams, need a full compliance check." Torres shifted, his boots scraping the concrete. Driscoll, maybe we don't— Stay out of it, specialist." Driscoll's eyes stayed on Mira, daring her to back down. "Strip search, upper body, standard for uncleared personnel." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Carver's chair scraped as he stood, his voice low and dangerous. "That's enough, Private." But Mira set her clipboard down on a workbench with a soft clack. Her hands moved to the zipper of her coveralls, and the bay went quieter still. The zipper rasped, tooth by tooth, revealing a plain black tank top beneath, the kind worn for sweat and function, not show. She shrugged the coveralls to her waist, tied the sleeves around her hips, and stood there, arms loose at her sides, her posture saying she'd faced worse than this. The mechanic stared, not with respect, but with the kind of leering curiosity that made your skin crawl. Driscoll smirked. "Turn around. Full check." And she did. The tank top was thin, clinging to her back from the heat, and it showed everything. Not just the lean muscle of someone who'd carried gear through hell, but the ink etched into her spine, a jagged black design that wasn't art, but a statement. A downward chevron, sharp as a dagger. Below it, a string of numbers, X094182, and at the base, just above her waist, the faint outline of a raven, wings spread like it was ready to claw its way out of her skin. Most of the bay didn't get it, just some old tattoo, maybe from her reservist days. Lee had his phone out, angled low, recording. "Check out the ink on Grandma," he muttered. Torres laughed, nervous, unsure. But Diaz, whose uncle had whispered stories of black ops units that vanished from records, felt his gut twist. He'd seen markings like that in faded Polaroids, the kind you burned after showing. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Elena Warwick strode through the hangar doors, her boots striking the concrete like gunfire. The maintenance log in her hand hit the floor with a crack that froze everyone in place. Her two aides, a major and a captain, stopped short, their eyes darting from their commander to the woman standing half-dressed in the middle of their bay. "Good God," Warwick breathed, because that chevron wasn't just a tattoo. It was the sigil of Shadow Company, a unit so classified it was a ghost, even to those with top clearance. The numbers? A mission code from Iraq, 2013, a botched extraction that left no survivors. Or so the reports claimed. And the Raven? That was the mark of operators abandoned behind enemy lines who carved their own way back, carrying secrets that could topple governments. Warwick had been a captain then, working signals intelligence at Balad. She'd seen the redacted files, the ones that vanished after a single read. She knew about the helo crash in Anbar, the 4 operators presumed dead, and the one who walked into a forward base 8 days later, bloodied but unbowed, with intel that stopped a coordinated insurgent strike. She also knew that Operator had been erased. New name, new life, orders to never exist again. Mira Voss wasn't just a contractor. She was a specter, the kind governments birthed when missions went to hell and heroes had to vanish for the greater good. But ink didn't lie, even when records did. Driscoll was still grinning, oblivious to the shift in the air, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Got anything to declare, ma'am?" Lee's phone stayed up, zooming in on Mira's back, his thumb hovering over the share button. "This is going viral," he muttered, half to himself. Mira began turning back, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was following orders from someone with real authority, not this kid playing at power. Her face was unreadable. No shame, no rage, just the calm of someone who'd stared down worse than a hangar full of gawkers. That's when Warwick's voice snapped like a whip. "Stand down, Private!" The words ricocheted off the hangar walls, killing every sound. Tools, engines, even the radio's static seemed to choke. Driscoll spun around, his smirk evaporating as he saw the colonel bearing down, her eyes locked on him like a missile tracking heat. "Sir, ma'am," he stammered, snapping to attention. "Just following security protocols." "Stand down." Warwick's tone was low now, the kind of quiet that made seasoned officers flinch. She crossed the hangar in measured steps, her aides trailing but keeping their distance, sensing the gravity of whatever was unfolding. Her gaze flicked to Mira, softening for a fraction of a second. "Ma'am, please get dressed." Mira nodded once, her hands moving to untie the coverall sleeves from her hips. She pulled the fabric back up, zipping it with the same steady precision she'd used to take it off, like this was just another task on her checklist. No rush, no defiance, just the quiet dignity of someone who'd walked through fire and learned to keep moving. Lee's phone was still raised, his finger twitching. "Ma'am, should I?" "You will delete that footage, now." Warwick's voice was steel, her eyes boring into him. "Or I'll have you up on charges for recording classified personnel without clearance." "Classified?" Lee blinked, his bravado crumbling. "She's just a—" "Delete it." Warwick's words left no room for debate. Lee fumbled with his phone, his fingers shaking as he swiped the video into oblivion, then shoved the device into his pocket like it burned. Torres looked away, his face flushed, while Diaz stood frozen, the weight of his uncle's stories sinking deeper. When Mira's coveralls were back in place, Warwick stepped closer, her voice dropping so only Mira could hear. "Shadow Company was dissolved in 14, she said, almost a whisper. "Officially," Mira replied, her tone matching Warwick's, a shared understanding passing between them. "No records of your service exist. That was the deal." "That was the deal." Mira's eyes held Warwick's, steady, unblinking, like she was confirming a truth they both knew too well. Warwick studied her, noting the faint scars on her jawline, the way her shoulders stayed squared even now, the subtle tension in her stance that said she was always ready to move. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, softer now. "Neither's that prototype in Bay 6, Mira said, her voice barely audible. "But here we are." Warwick's breath caught. The aircraft in Bay 6 was a stealth variant, classified so high even she needed special clearance to walk past it. No contractor should know it existed, let alone what it was. Unless that contractor's clearance ran deeper than any file Warwick could access. Unless she was exactly who Warwick feared, and hoped she was. The colonel turned to the mechanics, who stood like statues, sensing they'd stumbled into something far above their pay grade. Driscoll's face was ghost white, his earlier bravado gone. Lee clutched his pocket like he expected his phone to explode. Torres kept his eyes on the floor, while Diaz's gaze darted between Mira and Warwick, piecing together a puzzle he didn't want to solve. "Clear the hangar," Warwick ordered, her voice carrying across the bay. "Now." "Ma'am, we've got maintenance schedules." Diaz started, his voice hesitant. "I don't care if the Joint Chiefs are waiting for a polish. Out." Warwick's tone brooked no argument. "Anyone who breathes a word of this will be scrubbing latrines until they're eligible for retirement." The mechanics scattered, tools clattering as they grabbed their gear and bolted for the doors. Driscoll lingered, his mouth opening like he could talk his way out of this. "Ma'am, I was just following new security." Report to my office at 1500 hours, Private. Warwick cut him off, her voice cold. Bring your NCO. We're going to discuss what protocol actually means. Driscoll's shoulders slumped, his career flashing before his eyes. A meeting with the base commander and his supervisor meant paperwork that would haunt him for years. He shuffled out, head down, the weight of his mistake sinking in. When the hangar was empty, save for Warwick, her aides, and Mira, the colonel pulled out her phone and dialed a number that didn't show up on any directory. This is Warwick at Ironwood. I need immediate verification on a Mira Voss, contractor credentials. Priority 1. She listened, her face growing graver with each word. Understood. And her classification level? I see. Current status? Copy that. She ended the call, her hand lingering on the phone, then looked at Mira, who was calmly reviewing her inspection notes like nothing had happened. They say your clearance is above my grade, Warwick said, her voice tinged with something like awe. Then don't ask questions you can't get answers to, Mira replied, not looking up. But I can make sure you have what you need to do your job. Mira met her eyes. I need to finish my inspection and file my report. That's it. Warwick exhaled, realizing this woman wasn't just a ghost. She was a force, unshaken by what had just happened. After that scene, you want to keep working? After that scene, Mira said, her voice firm, this job needs to be done right. And that told Warwick everything. Mira wasn't here for apologies or justice. She was here because lives depended on her work, and she'd be damned if she let a few loudmouths stop her. For the next hour, Mira moved through Bay 4 with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't just inspect the Apache, she understood it, her hands tracing stress points on the airframe like she was reading Braille. She found a microfracture in a rotor mount that the pre-flight crew had missed, flagged a hydraulic line with early signs of wear, and noted a bearing that was off by a hair. Nothing critical yet, but enough to warrant a closer look in 50 hours. Each finding was logged with meticulous care, her pen moving across the clipboard like it was signing a blood oath. Master Sergeant Harlan Reese, a 30-year veteran who'd kept helicopters flying through 2 wars, wandered over to watch. He didn't speak, just observed as Mira checked the tail rotor, her fingers brushing the blades, feeling for balance. Off by a millimeter, she said without looking at him. Been that way for a while. Reese pulled up the maintenance logs on his tablet. Sure enough, pilots had reported a faint shudder during low-speed turns. Nothing to ground the bird, but enough to nag at the back of their minds. How'd you catch that without spinning it up? Blade weight, she said, tapping the tip. Feel the distribution. He did, and damn if she wasn't right. Reese had spent weeks chasing that shudder with diagnostics. She'd nailed it in minutes with her hands. You work overseas? He asked, careful, like he knew he was treading on thin ice. Places, she said, moving to the engine bay, her fingers ghosting over hydraulic lines, checking for heat stress. Same principles. Reese watched her work, noting the way she moved. Efficient, no wasted motion, like someone who'd patched aircraft under fire, who'd signed off on birds she'd have to fly in herself. He didn't push for more. Some stories didn't need telling. The hangar's rhythm resumed, but it wasn't the same. The air carried a new weight, like the aftermath of a near miss on a night mission. Mira worked through the Apache's airframe, her hands moving with the kind of instinct that came from years of keeping machines and people alive in places where hesitation meant death. She spotted a hairline crack in a fuselage panel, invisible to the untrained eye, and marked it for repair before it could spiderweb into something catastrophic. She tested a control linkage, her fingers catching a slight drag that could have locked up at the wrong moment. Every motion was deliberate, every note on her clipboard a promise that this bird would fly true. Word of what happened in Hangar 12 was already snaking through Ironwood Air Base, carried on whispers between maintenance crews and radio chatter between shifts. It wasn't the full story. No one outside that bay knew the details of Mira's tattoo or what it meant. But the gist was enough. A contractor had been messed with, and she turned out to be someone you didn't mess with. By the time Mira was halfway through her inspection, senior NCOs were finding reasons to swing by, their eyes lingering not on her, but on the way she worked, like they were witnessing a masterclass. Master Sergeant Reese stayed close, his tablet forgotten as he watched Mira trace a hydraulic line to its source. "Your number 1 pump's running warm," she said, her voice low, focused. "Housing's stressed. Feel here." She guided his hand to the pump's mounting bracket, where the metal vibrated with a faint, uneven hum. "It's working harder than it should." Reese checked the maintenance logs. The pump had been flagged for routine replacement in 6 months, but the heat readings were climbing faster than expected. "How'd you know?" "Metal expansion," Mira said, wiping her hands on a rag. "You feel it in the casing before the gauges catch up." Reese, who'd spent 3 decades coaxing helicopters through combat zones, felt a rare pang of humility. He'd been chasing that pump's issues with diagnostics and software. She'd diagnosed it with a touch. "You learned that in a manual?" he asked, half joking. "Learned it where manuals don't go," she replied, already moving to the next component. Lieutenant Colonel Warwick observed from the edge of the bay, her arms crossed, her mind still reeling from the call she'd made. The voice on the other end had been curt, clinical. Mira Voss's clearance was above top secret. Her operational status a black hole of redacted files. Warwick had seen her kind before. Operators who carried ghosts in their eyes, who moved like they were always half a second from reacting to a threat. But seeing that chevron tattoo, those numbers, that raven, it had shaken her. She'd read the reports from Iraq, the ones that vanished after one review. A helo down in the desert, a team written off, and one operator who walked out of the dunes with intel that saved a battalion. That operator was supposed to be a myth, erased from existence. Yet here she was, inspecting bolts like it was just another day. Mira's report, when she finished, was a thing of precision. 20 pages of observations, 3 critical recommendations that would have been missed by anyone less meticulous. A rotor mount that needed immediate replacement to avoid catastrophic failure. A hydraulic system showing early signs of cavitation that could have grounded the bird mid-mission. A wiring harness with insulation wear that could spark under high-altitude stress. Reese signed off as witness, his signature heavy with the weight of his reputation. 30 years of never passing a faulty aircraft. "Damn fine work, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the rare sincerity of a man who didn't waste praise. Warwick read the report twice, her fingers lingering on the pages. "Where'd you serve, really?" she asked, her voice low, like she was asking something forbidden. "Places that aren't on maps," Mira said, packing her tools into her battered toolbox. "Doing what?" "Things that don't make it to after-action reports." Warwick nodded, knowing better than to press. Some truths stayed buried, even for those with clearance to dig. She watched as Mira signed the final maintenance log, her handwriting as sharp as ever. But the duty sergeant, Carver, who'd seen his share of classified missions, noticed something else. The way she held the pen, her grip steady but calloused, the faint scar on her index finger that spoke of weapons handled under pressure. He'd seen hands like that on Spec Ops crew chiefs, the ones who flew missions that never happened. "Good work, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet with respect. Mira nodded, shouldering her toolbox. Warwick walked her to the hangar doors, the desert heat hitting them like a wall as they stepped into the glare. "You don't have to come back," Warwick said. "I can get you reassigned, somewhere you won't deal with this." Mira paused, her eyes scanning the flight line where young pilots were checking their aircraft, trusting their lives to the hands that maintained them. "I'll be back for the follow-up next month." Why? Warwick asked, genuinely curious. Mira's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the desert met the sky in a haze of heat. Because those kids need to learn that the quiet ones have stories too. And sometimes those stories are the ones that keep them alive. She walked away, her boots steady on the cracked tarmac, leaving Hangar 12 behind. The bay returned to its grind, tools clanking, engines humming. But something had shifted. A lesson had taken root, one that would echo through the base in ways no one could predict. At 1500 hours, Private Driscoll stood outside Warwick's office, his uniform pristine but his hands trembling. His NCO, Technical Sergeant Burke, stood beside him, his face grim. "Just tell the truth," Burke said, his voice low. "Don't make it worse." The door opened, and Warwick's aide waved them in. The meeting was short, 18 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When Driscoll emerged, his face was ashen, his career marked by a letter of reprimand, 6 weeks of extra duty, and mandatory training on handling classified personnel. But the real punishment was already spreading through the base, carried on the currents of military gossip. By the time the evening mess rolled around, every wrench turner and crew chief knew some version of the story. A contractor had been disrespected, and she turned out to be someone whose service was locked behind doors most of them would never open. Reese found Driscoll later in the enlisted club, staring into a soda he wasn't drinking. "Mind if I sit?" Reese asked, settling into the chair without waiting for an answer. Driscoll shrugged, his eyes fixed on the table. "Everyone's asking what I did." "They're asking because you need to get it," Reese said, leaning forward. "That woman you tried to break, she's the kind this base exists to serve, the kind who does the work that lets us all go home at night." "How was I supposed to know?" Driscoll muttered. "You weren't," Reese said. "That's why you treat people with respect until they prove they don't deserve it. You don't know who's carrying what kind of weight." Diaz caught up with Driscoll later, standing by a window overlooking the flight line, where the night crew was prepping Apaches under floodlights. "You get what you did, right?" Diaz said, his voice low, careful. "Everyone's telling me," Driscoll snapped, but there was no fight in it. "My uncle worked black ops in Somalia," Diaz said, staring at the aircraft. "Told me about people like her, the ones who did things we'll never read about, in places we'll never admit we were. You can always spot them. Way they move, way they watch everything without looking like it. Way they carry themselves like they've seen the worst and kept going." Driscoll stayed quiet, the weight of it settling in. "You humiliated someone who's probably saved more lives than you'll ever know," Diaz said. "And you did it because you thought she was nothing." The desert wind tugged at Mira's collar as she reached the base gate, lifting it just enough to show the edge of that chevron tattoo, stark against her skin. The guard, a weathered staff sergeant named Ortiz, with 32 years of service, and eyes that had seen too many classified comings and goings, caught the glimpse. He didn't stare, didn't ask questions, just handed back her credentials with a nod that carried more weight than words. "Safe travels, ma'am," he said, his voice low, respectful. "You too, Sergeant," Mira replied, her tone as steady as her footsteps. She stepped into the heat, the horizon swallowing her silhouette as the gate clanged shut behind her. Back in Hangar 12, the air still buzzed with the aftershock of what had happened. The mechanics had returned, their tools clattering with forced normalcy, but the usual banter was muted, replaced by sidelong glances and hushed conversations. The story of Mira Voss was already morphing into legend, each retelling adding a layer of awe or disbelief. By the next shift, the tale had spread to the mess hall, the barracks, the control tower. A contractor had been humiliated, and she'd turned out to be someone who carried secrets heavier than the Apaches she inspected. 3 weeks later, when another civilian tech arrived for a systems check, Hangar 12 was a different place. The crew was all business. Polite, professional, quick to offer tools or schematics instead of attitude. They asked about clearances with respect, not suspicion, and checked credentials without posturing. The lesson had sunk in, not through formal briefings, but through the kind of unspoken code that binds military life. You don't know who you're dealing with until you do. And by then, it's too late to undo your mistakes. Master Sergeant Reese made it part of his training for new mechanics, not by recounting Mira's story that stayed locked in Hangar 12, but by drilling the principle behind it. "Respect the quiet ones," he'd say, his voice gruff as he handed out torque wrenches to wide-eyed recruits. "The ones who don't brag, who just do the work. They're usually the ones who've seen things you can't imagine. Treat them like it." Lieutenant Colonel Warwick kept Mira's inspection report on her desk, not filed away with the others, but pinned under a paperweight shaped like a rotor blade. It wasn't just the report's precision, though its recommendations had already prevented a hydraulic failure that could have downed a bird mid-flight. It was what the report represented: excellence that didn't shout, competence that didn't need applause. It was a reminder of the kind of people who kept the military's heart beating, even if their names never made it to award ceremonies or history books. Mira's work had left its mark in other ways. The hairline crack she'd flagged in the fuselage was repaired before it could spread, saving an Apache from a mid-air failure. The hydraulic pump she'd called out was replaced early, averting a potential blowout during a training run. Her notes on the wiring harness led to a full systems check that caught a dozen other weak points across the fleet. Pilots who'd never meet her flew safer because of her hands, her eyes, her refusal to let humiliation stop her from doing the job right. The base's rhythm carried on. Engines roared, tools clinked, radios crackled. But the lesson lingered. Crew chiefs swapped stories over coffee, not about Mira's tattoo or the classified unit it hinted at, but about the way she'd worked. Steady, unflinching, like someone who'd patched aircraft under fire and signed off on them with her own life on the line. They talked about the way she'd handled Driscoll's stunt. Not with anger, but with a quiet strength that made his bravado look small. Driscoll himself was a changed man, though not by choice. The letter of reprimand in his file was a permanent scar, a warning to every CO who'd ever review his record. The extra duty, 6 weeks of scrubbing hangar floors and inventorying parts, left him with blisters and a bruised ego. The mandatory training on handling classified personnel was a daily reminder of his mistake, each session hammering home the weight of what he'd done. But the real lesson came from the base itself, from the way his peers looked at him now, not with pity, but with the quiet judgment of those who'd seen him cross a line. Reese caught him one evening outside the maintenance bay, staring at the Apaches lined up under the floodlights, their blades glinting like knives in the dusk. "You still thinking about it?" Reese asked, leaning against a crate. Driscoll nodded, his jaw tight. "Can't stop." "Good," Reese said. "Means you're learning. That woman you tried to break, she's the kind who keeps these birds in the air, the kind who makes sure pilots come home. You don't get to know their stories, but you damn well better respect their work." Driscoll's eyes stayed on the aircraft. "How do you know who they are?" "You don't," Reese said. "That's why you start with respect and work from there. Assume everyone's carrying something you can't see." Diaz found him later, sitting on a bench near the runway, watching a helo lift off into the night. "You get it now, don't you?" Diaz said, his voice softer than before. Driscoll exhaled, his breath visible in the cooling air. "Yeah, I get it. My uncle used to say the real heroes don't wear medals," Diaz went on. "They wear scars, calluses, ink that tells stories you'll never hear. You crossed one of them, and you didn't even know it." Driscoll didn't reply, but his silence said enough. The weight of his actions had settled in, not just as punishment, but as a lesson he'd carry for the rest of his career. Mira's departure hadn't been dramatic. No speeches, no confrontations. She'd walked out of Hangar 12 with her toolbox slung over her shoulder, her clipboard tucked under her arm, her steps as steady as they'd been when she arrived. But she'd left something behind, a shift in the air, a ripple that would outlast her visit. The mechanics who'd watched her work, the NCOs who'd signed her reports, the pilots who'd never know her name. They all carried a piece of what she'd shown them. That quiet didn't mean weak. That competence didn't need a megaphone. That the people who mattered most were often the ones who said the least. Months passed, and Ironwood Air Base settled back into its relentless cadence, rotors spinning, tools grinding, the desert sun baking everything in sight. But Hangar 12 never quite forgot Mira Voss. Her name didn't linger in official reports or personnel files. It was scrubbed clean, just like her service record. Yet her presence echoed in the small ways that matter on a military base. The way a wrench was handed to a contractor with a nod instead of a sneer. The way questions about clearance were asked with respect rather than challenge. The lesson she'd left behind had taken root, not in memos or briefings, but in the unspoken code that governed the men and women who kept the machines alive. Master Sergeant Reese made it his mission to ensure the lesson stuck. During morning roll calls, he'd weave it into his talks with the new recruits, kids fresh from tech school, their boots still shiny, their egos bigger than their toolkits. You see someone quiet, carrying a beat-up toolbox, don't assume they're nobody, he'd say, his voice rough as the desert wind. They might be the one who's kept birds like these flying through hell. Respect the work, not the noise. He never mentioned Mira by name, but the mechanics who'd been in Hangar 12 that day knew exactly who he meant. Lieutenant Colonel Warwick kept Mira's report on her desk until the paper edges curled. A silent reminder of what excellence looked like when it didn't demand attention. She'd pushed through changes after that day. Stricter protocols for contractor interactions, mandatory briefings on respecting classified personnel, and a quiet word to every NCO to keep their people in line. But more than that, she carried a new weight in her own decisions, a reminder that the people who mattered most often walked through her base unnoticed, their stories locked behind scars and ink. Private Driscoll's career didn't end, but it changed. The letter of reprimand followed him like a shadow, a permanent mark that made promotion boards hesitate. The extra duty, weeks of scrubbing hangar floors and sorting bolts, left him with calluses and a humility he hadn't known he needed. The training sessions on classified personnel were a daily grind, each one a reminder of the line he'd crossed. But the real change came from the base itself, from the way his peers treated him. Not with scorn, but with the quiet expectation that he'd learn from his mistake. By the time his extra duty ended, he was different, quieter, more careful, less likely to assume he knew who he was dealing with. Diaz became his unofficial mentor, not because he was asked, but because he saw something in Driscoll worth saving. Late one night, as they cleaned tools in the maintenance bay, Diaz spoke up. "My uncle told me once about a guy he served with in Mogadishu. Never said much, always worked alone. Turned out he'd pulled 3 men out of a downed Black Hawk under fire. Nobody knew until years later, when the story leaked. That's who you messed with, Driscoll. Someone like that." Driscoll wiped grease from a wrench, his movements slow. "How do you know who they are?" "You don't," Diaz said, his eyes on the tool in his hand. "That's why you start with respect. Assume everyone's got a story you'll never hear." The Apaches Mira had inspected flew smoother after her visit, their pilots unaware of the hands that had kept them aloft. The rotor mount she'd flagged was replaced before it could fail mid-flight. The hydraulic pump was swapped out, averting a blowout that could have grounded a mission. Her wiring harness notes led to a fleet-wide check that caught weaknesses no one else had seen. Lives were saved, not with fanfare or medals, but with the quiet precision of a woman who'd learned her trade in places where failure wasn't an option. The base's gossip mill kept Mira's story alive, though the details blurred with each retelling. Some said she was ex-Special Forces. Others swore she'd been CIA. A few claimed she'd walked out of a war zone carrying classified intel that stopped a major attack. The truth was, both simpler and heavier. She was a ghost, a relic of missions that never happened, a hero who'd been erased for the sake of secrets. Her tattoo, that chevron, those numbers, that raven, was the only record of a life spent in shadows. When Mira returned a month later for the follow-up inspection, Hangar 12 was ready. The crew greeted her with nods, not questions. Tools were offered before she asked. Schematics were pulled up without prompting. Driscoll was there, quieter now, his boots still polished, but his attitude gone. He didn't speak to her, but his eyes followed her work, noting the way her hands moved over the aircraft like they knew its soul. When she flagged a misaligned tail rotor, he was the first to grab a wrench, offering it without a word. Reese watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his weathered face. "She's the real deal," he muttered to Carver, who joined him to observe. "Seen it before, in Kuwait. Crew chiefs who could feel a bird's heartbeat." "They don't teach that in tech school?" Carver nodded, his eyes on Mira as she checked a hydraulic line. "She's got scars that tell stories we'll never hear." Mira finished her inspection in half the time it should have taken, her report as meticulous as before. She signed it with the same sharp handwriting, her pen moving like it was carving her name into history, even if that history would never be read. When she handed the log to Carver, he took it with a nod that felt like a salute. "Good work, ma'am." She shouldered her toolbox and walked out, the desert heat swallowing her once more. But this time, the hangar didn't return to normal quite so fast. The crew lingered, watching her go, knowing they'd seen something rare. A glimpse of someone who carried the weight of wars they'd never understand. Who did the work that let them sleep at night. Who walked away without asking for thanks.